Hi guys, in this episode we're going to explore the behavior that's associated with changing habitats, so moving house, shall we say. Now, evolutionary biologists are particularly interested in populations or species moving into new habitats because ultimately those individuals that move into that novel habitat will be exposed to novel selection pressures. So it offers a unique opportunity to study how adaptation works. Now, in the context of what would prompt individuals of a population to make the move into a new habitat, there are a variety of ecological and abiotic factors that might prompt individuals to move habitat. For example, perhaps there are new resources in that novel habitat that don't exist in the ancestral habitat. So there would be an adaptive incentive to move into that new environment where there is better food or more food or a different type of shelter. Whatever it is, it's a particular resource that that species might need to survive. Alternatively, they may be actually trying to escape something. So perhaps it's competition from conspecifics or other species in their original ancestral environment for those resources. So perhaps there is a particular food type that a bunch of different species are trying to exploit. So there's a lot of competition for that type of resource. The individual might actually be escaping something, and in particular, parasitism, but especially predation. A lot of cases where species or populations move into a new environment, it's to escape predators that are present in the ancestral environment. So obviously, if you can move house into an area where there aren't so many predators, despite the fact that that environment might be quite different, there may actually still be a strong adaptive incentive to do so because you're more likely to survive because there is a lack or lower density of predators. Now, when we talk about species or populations moving in habitat, we kind of need to know what differences in habitat might be. And it's all species dependent, right? So you might have a particular bird that lives in a forest and is adapted to a forest environment and the resources, the food, and the shelter, and all sorts of things associated with forests. Right next door to that forest might be an open grassland. Now that open grassland has very different thermal requirements, has different insect biota, it has different plants, a whole bunch of different things that don't exist in the forest. So the bird species, if it moves from that forest environment into that grassland, is it going to be exposed to lots of different new selective challenges. So there has to be a reason for that bird species to ultimately move into that grassland environment in the first place, because invariably it's not going to be as well adapted to that environment as it would be in the forest environment. Another example would be lizards that might actually live in this deep shade foliage area in the intertidal zone on Guam, but right next door to it, there's the open rocks, which has a very different thermal requirement, exposed to sun, heats up high in during the day. Insect biota again is going to be very different, and the refuges that a lizard might actually have is very different. Now, these environments are literally meters apart. So when we talk about individuals moving, colonizing a new habitat, we're not necessarily talking about, hundreds of kilometers apart, which would require a certain amount of dispersal. We may actually be talking about an environment that's immediately next door in a matter of meters. Now, later in this episode, we're actually going to talk about the evolution of amphibious behavior. Now, this is an extreme example of a species moving from one environment, water, out of that environment to a new environment, which is land, where obviously you can imagine the characteristics of water versus land are vastly different. So there are a number of different hypotheses for why fish might want to come out of water. One of the key hypotheses is related to the intertidal zone. And indeed, we have a great proportion of the evolution of amphibious behaviour in fish occurring in the intertidal zone. And what we think might be happening is, as the tide recedes, and particularly at low tide, we have the formation of all these rock pools. And if you're a fish, being aquatic, the only place that you can occur is in the rock pool, right? It makes pretty much sense. The thing is, though, we're in the tropics, so right now It's extremely hot. In fact, I should probably be wearing a hat. And the water tends to warm up. So all amongst these seaweed and rock pools around me are lots of little fish that have retreated into the shade. But they're not going to escape the fact that the temperature of the water is going to be progressively increased the longer the tide is out, and obviously from the amount of solar radiation hitting the water. So the hypothesis centers on the water warming up, and ultimately perhaps it is safer and better for survival for fish to retreat into rock crevices or rock holes as the tide recedes, rather than face the increasingly warm rock pools. So heat stress. Heat stress in lots of different ectotherms, including fish, is a big problem. So perhaps it's just actually better for survival for, as the tide recedes, to just try and find a rock hole or a rock to hide under, and then just wait for the tide to come back in. But otherwise, they're actually out of the water. The other situation that occurs with the water warming up is that the amount of oxygen tends to get leached from that water as well. It's just the process of the water warming up. The other thing that could also be happening is the evaporation of the rock pool. So we have a general salinity of seawater that's roughly about 35%. And as evaporation occurs, the salinity of the water might actually increase as well. So we've got three factors here. We've got increasing temperature. We've got decreasing oxygen. Now, decreasing oxygen is a problem because it means the fish may ultimately asphyxiate. So they may actually suffocate because there's not enough oxygen in the water for them to breathe. And the third one is rising salinity. Now, these are three factors that we believe might be prompting fish to come out of the water. These are essentially abiotic factors. So again, the logic being it's better for a fish if they can find a rock hole that's moist, or underneath a rock that's moist so they don't dry out, but they're otherwise out of the water as the tide recedes, and then wait for that tide to come back in, and then they can swim off again. So this has been a long-standing hypothesis for decades. The thing is, no one's actually tested it. So we've come to Guam to actually try and figure this out. Is this the reason why these blennies do come out of the water? So what we're doing is we are deploying a bunch of oxygen and temperature probes all amongst these rock pools. And we're leaving them there as the tide goes out. And at low tide, we come in and we also measure pH, the salinity of the water, but also the turgidity, basically the quality of the water within these ponds. And the idea is, if that hypothesis about the abiotic chemistry of the water playing a key role in pushing these fish out of the water, then we should actually see, first of all, that the water progressively increases in temperature, and as a consequence of that, the amount of oxygen in the water decreases, and the amount of salinity also increases through evaporation. So we're deploying a whole bunch of these probes, we're measuring a whole bunch of these different parameters, and we're just going to see to what extent is that hypothesis actually true. It's pretty simple.